The morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete barriers that surrounded Haven City, the final bastion of human civilization in what was once the United States of America. Commander Zephyr Blackwood stood atop the eastern watchtower, his weathered hands gripping the rail as he surveyed the endless wasteland beyond. The air carried the putrid stench of decay, a constant reminder that death had claimed 90% of the continent's population in the span of just 18 months. Below in the fortress courtyard, survivors moved with the practiced efficiency of people who had learned that hesitation meant death. Children who should have been playing hopscotch instead learned to identify the different types of infected by their gait and groaning patterns. The lucky ones still remembered what laughter sounded like. Dr. Cassiopeia Thorne emerged from the underground research facility, her lab coat stained with substances that Zephyr preferred not to identify. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and dark circles under her green eyes spoke of countless sleepless nights spent searching for answers that seemed increasingly elusive. She approached the commander with the same determined stride she'd maintained since the outbreak began, carrying a manila folder that he hoped contained better news than her last report. "Commander, we need to talk," Cassiopeia said, her voice carrying the weight of discoveries that could either save or damn them all. The folder in her hand seemed to pulse with significance, and Zephyr noticed the slight tremor in her usually steady fingers. Inside the command center, Alistair Ravencroft paced behind a bank of monitors displaying feeds from their perimeter cameras. The former Secretary of Defense had aged a decade in the past year, his silver hair now completely white and his once proud shoulders stooped with the burden of impossible decisions. The screens showed the same horrifying tableau they'd displayed for months. Thousands upon thousands of infected pressing against their defenses, their numbers growing daily as more survivors from distant settlements were overrun and converted. Seraphina Cross sat at the communication station, her headset crackling with desperate pleas from scattered survivor groups across the continent. Each transmission that went silent represented another pocket of humanity snuffed out, another small light extinguished in the growing darkness. Her dark skin glistened with perspiration as she worked tirelessly to coordinate supply drops and evacuation efforts, knowing that each success was measured against 100 failures. The infected had evolved since the early days of the outbreak. What began as shambling corpses driven by base hunger had transformed into something far more terrifying. The newer variants retained fragments of human intelligence, enough to use simple tools and coordinate basic strategies. Some could even mimic human speech, luring survivors into deadly traps with cries for help that sounded heartbreakingly genuine. Dante Wolfsburg kicked open the reinforced doors to the command center, his black tactical gear splattered with fresh blood and gore. The former Marine had lost his entire unit in the Battle of Chicago, and since then had operated as a one-man wrecking crew against the infected hordes. His ice-blue eyes held the wild intensity of someone who had stared into the abyss so long that it had begun staring back. "The western perimeter is compromised," Dante announced without preamble, dropping his spent rifle onto the strategy table with a metallic clang. "New strain. They're climbing the walls like goddamn spiders. We've got maybe 6 hours before they breach the outer defenses." Dr. Ophelia Sterling looked up from her medical station where she'd been treating a steady stream of wounded defenders. Her gentle features belied the steel core that had kept her functioning through months of unimaginable horror. The former pediatrician had been forced to make decisions that violated every oath she'd ever taken, but she continued to fight for every life that could still be saved. Maximus Kane, the grizzled veteran who commanded the fortress's defensive forces, studied the tactical displays with the calculating gaze of someone who had seen too many battles. His prosthetic left arm, lost in the evacuation of Detroit, gleamed dully in the artificial light as he traced potential breach points on the digital map. Communications specialist Lyra Nightingale suddenly straightened at her station, her eyes wide with a mixture of hope and terror. "Commander, I'm picking up a transmission from the CDC facility in Atlanta. They're claiming to have developed a countermeasure, but..." She paused, her voice breaking slightly. "The cost is something they can only discuss in person." Zephyr felt the weight of 70,000 lives pressing down on his shoulders. Haven City housed the largest concentration of survivors in North America, possibly the world. Every decision he made would ripple across the future of human civilization, if such a future still existed. The infected masses beyond their walls seemed to sense that this was humanity's last stand, their numbers swelling daily as if drawn by some primal instinct to witness the final chapter of mankind's story. As the sun reached its zenith, casting harsh shadows across the fortress walls, Zephyr realized that the next 24 hours would determine whether humanity would find a way to reclaim their world or whether the infected would finally complete their grotesque transformation of Earth into a charnel house of the walking dead. Dr. Cassiopeia Thorne's hands trembled as she opened the manila folder, spreading its contents across the command table with the reverence of someone handling radioactive material. The photographs inside depicted microscopic images that looked like beautiful, deadly flowers blooming in petri dishes. Each image represented months of research conducted in the deepest levels of Haven City's underground laboratories, work that had cost the lives of 17 volunteer researchers who had exposed themselves to controlled doses of the infection. "What you're looking at," Cassiopeia began, her voice barely above a whisper, "is the evolutionary progression of the pathogen over the past 18 months. It's not just adapting to our countermeasures, it's learning from them." She pointed to a series of cellular structures that seemed to pulse with malevolent life even in the static photographs. The latest samples show unprecedented neural development. The infected aren't just driven by hunger anymore. They're developing strategy, memory, and something that resembles primitive communication. Commander Zephyr felt a chill run down his spine as he studied the images. In the early days of the outbreak, they had hoped that the infected would eventually decay beyond the point of mobility, that time itself would be their salvation. Instead, the pathogen had found ways to preserve and even enhance the host bodies, creating creatures that were stronger and more resilient than living humans. Alistair Ravencroft leaned over the table, his face pale as he absorbed the implications. "Are you telling us that we're not just fighting zombies anymore? That these things are developing intelligence?" "I'm telling you that we may have fundamentally misunderstood what we're dealing with from the beginning," Cassiopeia replied, pulling out another set of documents. "The pathogen doesn't just reanimate dead tissue, it creates a new form of collective consciousness. Every infected individual is essentially a node in a vast network. They share information, adapt to threats, and coordinate attacks on a scale we never imagined possible." Serafina Cross looked up from her communication station, her dark eyes reflecting the grim reality of the situation. "That would explain the synchronized attacks we've been seeing across different settlement locations. Command, I've documented 17 separate incidents where infected forces seem to know exactly where to strike for maximum damage, almost as if they had access to our defensive plans." Dante Wolfsburg slammed his fist on the table, causing the photographs to scatter. "So you're saying these bastards are getting smarter while we're sitting here getting weaker? Every day we lose more people, more supplies, more hope, and they're out there forming some kind of hive mind?" The reality of their situation settled over the command center like a suffocating blanket. Dr. Ophelia Sterling had joined them from the medical bay, her surgical scrub stained with the blood of defenders who had fought valiantly but ultimately futilely against an enemy that was evolving faster than their ability to counter it. She had seen the progression firsthand in the wounds she treated, bite marks that showed increasing precision, infections that spread with mathematical efficiency, and a level of tactical awareness in the attacking forces that suggested planning and forethought. Lyra Nightingale's voice cut through the heavy silence. "The transmission from Atlanta is coming through again. They're insisting on direct communication with command authority. They claim to have information about something they're calling Project Renaissance, but they won't discuss details over open channels." Maximus Kane studied the defensive readouts with growing concern. "Our ammunition reserves are down to 40%, and that's after rationing. Food supplies will last maybe another month if we're lucky. The water purification systems are running at 60% efficiency due to damaged components we can't replace. Even if we could hold the walls indefinitely, we're fighting a war of attrition we cannot win." Zephyr absorbed the cascade of bad news with the stoic expression that had kept his people's morale intact through the darkest months of human history. The weight of command had carved deep lines in his face, and his steel-gray eyes held the haunted look of someone who had been forced to make decisions that would have broken him in peacetime. Every night, he dreamed of the faces of those he had been unable to save, and every morning, he woke to the responsibility of protecting those who remained. The infected beyond the walls seemed to sense the growing desperation within Haven City. Their constant moaning had taken on different tones and rhythms, almost like a primitive form of music that spoke of patience and inevitable victory. Scouts reported that the creatures had begun constructing crude ladders and siege equipment from the debris of destroyed cities, working with a coordination that defied everything they thought they knew about the infected. As evening approached, Cassiopeia pulled Zephyr aside, her expression grave. "There's something else, Commander. Something I haven't told the others yet." She lowered her voice to ensure their conversation remained private. "The pathogen samples we've been studying, they're not just evolving randomly. The changes show signs of deliberate genetic manipulation. Someone or something is guiding this evolution, shaping these creatures into more effective killers." The implications of her words hit Zephyr like a physical blow. If the infected were being controlled or directed by some intelligence, then everything they had assumed about the outbreak was wrong. They weren't just fighting a biological disaster, they were engaged in a war against an enemy that possessed capabilities they couldn't begin to comprehend. Outside the fortress walls, thousands of infected faces turned toward Haven City as darkness fell, their dead eyes reflecting the flickering lights of humanity's last stronghold with what almost looked like anticipation. The communications array crackled to life in the pre-dawn hours, its signal cutting through the static like a lighthouse beam piercing fog. Lyra Nightingale adjusted her headset with practiced precision, her fingers dancing across the console as she worked to strengthen the incoming transmission. The voice that emerged from the speakers carried the weight of exhaustion and desperate hope, speaking from what remained of the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta. "Haven City, this is Dr. Marcus Webb broadcasting from CDC Atlanta. We have critical information regarding Project Renaissance. Repeat, we have developed a potential solution, but it requires immediate coordination with your research team. Time is running short for all of us." Commander Zephyr stood behind Lyra, his jaw clenched as he processed the implications. Communications with the outside world had become increasingly rare as settlements fell and transmission stations went dark. The fact that anyone was still operating out of Atlanta was miraculous in itself, given that the city had been overrun months ago according to their last intelligence reports. Dr. Cassiopeia Thorne hurried to the communication station, her lab coat billowing behind her as she moved with urgent purpose. "Dr. Webb, this is Dr. Cassiopeia Thorne, Chief Researcher at Haven City. What can you tell us about Project Renaissance? We need specifics, our situation here is deteriorating rapidly." The response came through layers of static and interference, as if the signal was being actively suppressed or jammed. "Dr. Thorne, we've been monitoring your research broadcasts. Your findings about the pathogen's evolution are correct, but incomplete. The infected aren't just developing intelligence, they're being directed by a central consciousness that exists within the pathogen network itself. We've identified the source, but neutralizing it requires a coordinated strike that will demand everything we have left." Alistair Ravencroft moved closer to the console, his political instincts sensing layers of hidden meaning in the transmission. Throughout his career in government, he had learned to read between the lines of carefully worded communications, and something about Dr. Webb's tone suggested that Project Renaissance came with costs that weren't being fully disclosed. Dante Wolfsburg leaned against the wall, his arms crossed and his expression skeptical. The battle-hardened Marine had learned not to trust solutions that sounded too good to be true, especially when they came from sources that should have been dead for months. "How do we know you're really who you claim to be? How do we know this isn't some kind of trap orchestrated by whatever intelligence is controlling the infected?" The question hung in the air for several long moments before Dr. Webb's voice returned, now carrying a note of weary understanding. "You're right to be suspicious, Mr. Wolfsburg. Yes, we know who you are, we've been monitoring Haven City's communications for weeks. To prove our authenticity, I'll share information that only the real CDC would possess. Dr. Thorne, your preliminary research on cellular regeneration patterns in infected tissue showed a 17% variance from standard decay rates. Your classified report dated November 15 identified a unique protein sequence that you designated Alpha 77 Delta. That information never left your secure channels. Cassiopeia's face went pale as she heard details that were indeed known only to her inner research circle. The security implications were staggering, but the accuracy of the information suggested that Dr. Webb was legitimate. What do you need from us, Dr. Webb? And what exactly does Project Renaissance entail? Project Renaissance is a viral countermeasure designed to disrupt the pathogen's collective consciousness by introducing a competing signal into the network. Think of it as a kind of neurological virus that targets the communication pathways between infected individuals. If successful, it would break the hive mind and return the infected to their original, mindless state. Dr. Ophelia Sterling had joined the group, her medical background allowing her to grasp the theoretical framework immediately. What you're describing sounds like it would require massive computational power and a delivery system capable of reaching infected populations across an entire continent. How is that possible with current infrastructure? The pause before Dr. Webb's response stretched uncomfortably long. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of grim resignation. The delivery system already exists, Dr. Sterling. The government maintains several classified satellite networks designed for exactly this type of scenario. However, activating Project Renaissance requires sacrificing one of the remaining population centers to serve as a transmission hub. The electromagnetic pulse generated by the countermeasure will render the chosen location uninhabitable for human life. The silence in the command center was deafening as the full implications of Dr. Webb's words sank in. Serafina Cross slowly removed her headset, her hands shaking as she realized that any salvation for humanity would come at an unthinkable price. Maximus Kane stared at the tactical displays showing Haven City's 70,000 residents, each life now balanced against the possibility of saving the remainder of human civilization. Zephyr felt the weight of command pressing down on him with crushing force. Every leader throughout history had been forced to make impossible choices, but few had faced a decision that would literally determine the fate of their species. The infected masses beyond their walls continued their patient vigil, unaware that their destruction might require the sacrifice of the very people they sought to consume. Dr. Webb, Zephyr said finally, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to ask, what kind of timeframe are we looking at? How long do we have to make this decision? Based on our calculations of infected migration patterns and resource depletion rates, Haven City has perhaps 48 hours before your defenses are completely overwhelmed. After that point, there won't be enough surviving population centers to make Project Renaissance viable. Commander, I wish I could offer you an alternative, but our models all point to the same conclusion: without immediate action, humanity has less than 6 months before complete extinction. The War Council convened in the deepest level of Haven City's command bunker, where reinforced concrete walls provided both physical protection and psychological comfort. The room's harsh fluorescent lighting cast stark shadows across the faces of humanity's remaining leaders as they grappled with the most consequential decision in human history. Maps covered every available surface, showing the global spread of the infection and the dwindling islands of human survival scattered across what had once been thriving continents. Commander Zephyr Blackwood stood at the head of the oval table, his weathered hands pressed flat against its surface as he studied the faces of his advisors. Each person in this room represented thousands of lives and decades of experience, yet none of their combined wisdom seemed adequate to the task before them. The decision they made in the coming hours would echo through whatever remained of human civilization, assuming any civilization survived to remember it. Dr. Cassiopeia Thorne had spread her research findings across one end of the table, creating a mosaic of scientific data that painted a picture of humanity's rapid decline. Her latest calculations showed that even if they could hold Haven City's defenses for another month, the mathematical progression of the infection guaranteed total human extinction within 6 months. The pathogen's evolution was accelerating, and each day brought new variants that were stronger, smarter, and more lethal than their predecessors. The moral calculus is unavoidable, Cassiopeia said, her voice barely above a whisper. 70,000 lives weighed against the continuation of human existence. In any reasonable framework of ethics, the choice should be clear, but knowing something intellectually and accepting it emotionally are entirely different challenges. Alistair Ravencroft had been unusually quiet throughout the discussion, his political instincts warring with the stark realities of their situation. Throughout his career, he had made decisions that affected millions of lives, but those choices had always been bounded by constitutional law and democratic oversight. Now, in humanity's final hours, such luxuries no longer existed. "I've been thinking about precedent," he said finally. "Throughout history, leaders have been forced to sacrifice the few to save the many. What we're contemplating isn't unprecedented in principle, only in scale." Dante Wolfsburg slammed his fist on the table with enough force to rattle the coffee cups scattered across its surface. "Precedent? You want to talk about precedent? Every single person in this city fought their way here through hell. They watched their families die, their cities burn, their entire world collapse. And now we're supposed to tell them that they made it this far just to become martyrs for a plan that might not even work?" The silence that followed Dante's outburst was heavy with unspoken truths. Every survivor in Haven City carried stories of loss that would have been unimaginable 18 months ago. Children who had watched their parents die, parents who had been forced to leave children behind, soldiers who had held the line while their comrades fell around them. They had endured the unendurable, survived the unsurvivable, and clung to hope when hope seemed impossible. Dr. Ophelia Sterling spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had held dying hands and whispered final comfort to countless patients. "I've been running the medical projections on Project Renaissance. Even if the countermeasure works perfectly, the electromagnetic pulse will cause immediate cardiac arrest in approximately 15% of our population. Another 30% will suffer severe neurological damage from the energy discharge. We're not just talking about sacrifice, we're talking about condemning tens of thousands of people to agonizing deaths." Serafina Cross had been monitoring communications from the handful of remaining survivor settlements scattered across the continent. Her reports painted a picture of humanity's final diaspora, small groups of desperate people making last stands in shopping malls, subway tunnels, and abandoned military bases. Each transmission that went silent represented another light extinguished in the growing darkness. "The settlement in Denver went dark 3 hours ago," she announced. "That leaves maybe a dozen active survivor groups with populations over 100 people. We might be looking at fewer than 200,000 humans left alive on the entire continent." Maximus Kane studied the tactical situation with the cold analysis of a professional soldier. His prosthetic arm gleamed dully in the fluorescent light as he traced defensive positions on the digital maps. "Our eastern perimeter is holding for now, but barely. The new climbing variants have reached the outer wall in 17 different locations. We're plugging gaps with volunteer civilians who have maybe 4 hours of combat training. By tomorrow night, they'll be inside the outer ring. By the end of the week, they'll be here in this room." Lyra Nightingale looked up from her communication station, her young face bearing the premature lines of someone who had aged years in months. "I'm still receiving periodic transmissions from overseas. London fell 6 hours ago. Tokyo has been silent for 12 hours. The Australian settlements are reporting coordinated attacks that suggest the infected are communicating across oceanic distances. This isn't just about America anymore, it's about the entire human species." Zephyr walked to the reinforced window that provided a view of the fortress's central courtyard. Below, children played games adapted for their new reality while their parents stood guard with weapons that would have been unthinkable in civilian hands just 2 years ago. A young girl, perhaps 8 years old, laughed as she ran between improvised obstacles, her joy a defiant spark of humanity in a world consumed by death and decay. "Dr. Webb," Zephyr said, activating the communications link to Atlanta. "If we agree to this, what guarantee do we have that Project Renaissance will actually work? What happens if we sacrifice Haven City and the countermeasure fails?" The response carried the weight of a man who had already made peace with impossible choices. "Commander, I can't give you guarantees. Our computer models suggest a 73% probability of success, but models are only as good as the data they're based on. What I can tell you is that without Project Renaissance, human extinction is mathematically certain. With it, we at least have a chance." As night fell over Haven City, 70,000 people went about their evening routines, unaware that their leaders were weighing their lives against the future of human civilization. In the growing darkness beyond the walls, millions of infected eyes reflected the fortress lights, patient and hungry, waiting for the moment when humanity's last defense would finally crumble. The emergency session continued through the night as reports filtered in from the remaining outposts of human civilization. Each transmission painted a progressively darker picture. The military installation in Colorado Springs had fallen to a coordinated assault that showed unprecedented tactical sophistication, while the survivor colony in the Seattle underground reported that infected individuals were now attempting to communicate with them using fragmented human speech. The collective intelligence that Dr. Cassiopeia Thorne had theorized was no longer theoretical, it was demonstrating capabilities that suggested the pathogen had evolved far beyond their worst-case scenarios. Dr. Marcus Webb's voice crackled through the communication array with increasing urgency as dawn approached. "Haven City, our monitoring stations are detecting massive infected migrations converging on your position. We estimate over 2 million infected individuals are moving toward your coordinates from multiple directions. This isn't random movement, it's a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm your defenses through sheer numbers." Commander Zephyr felt the familiar weight of command settle over his shoulders like a lead blanket. Military intelligence suggested that the infected had somehow identified Haven City as humanity's primary stronghold and were marshalling their forces for what could only be described as a final solution to the human problem. The irony wasn't lost on him that the same species that had once dominated Earth through intelligence and coordination was now being hunted to extinction by enemies employing identical strategies. Maximus Kane's tactical assessment confirmed their worst fears. "Based on current defensive capabilities and ammunition reserves, we can hold against standard infected for perhaps 18 hours. Against 2 million coordinated attackers using siege tactics, we're looking at maybe 6 hours before the outer perimeter falls." His prosthetic arm clicked softly as he manipulated the holographic displays showing defensive positions and estimated attack vectors. Dr. Ophelia Sterling had been moving between the medical bay and the command center, bringing increasingly disturbing reports about the wounded defenders being brought in from the outer walls. "The bite patterns are different," she announced, her voice tight with professional concern. "The infected aren't just attacking randomly anymore. They're targeting specific anatomical points to maximize damage and infection rates. Some of the wounds show evidence of surgical precision. These creatures are learning human anatomy and exploiting our vulnerabilities with mathematical efficiency." Serafina Cross suddenly straightened at her communication station, her face pale as she processed an incoming transmission. "Commander, I'm receiving a broadcast on emergency frequencies. It's coming from inside the infected horde surrounding us." She adjusted her equipment with trembling hands, trying to isolate the signal from the interference that seemed to pulse with malevolent purpose. The voice that emerged from the speakers was unmistakably human in cadence and tone, yet carried an otherworldly quality that sent chills through everyone present. "Survivors of Haven City, this is the voice of what you call the infected. We are no longer the mindless creatures you once knew. We have evolved, learned, and grown beyond your understanding. We offer you a choice: surrender now and join us willingly, or face complete annihilation when our forces breach your defenses." Dante Wolfsburg reached for his sidearm instinctively, his combat-hardened reflexes responding to a threat that couldn't be shot or stabbed. "What the hell is that thing? How are they broadcasting on our frequencies?" Dr. Cassiopeia Thorne studied the audio waveforms with growing fascination and horror. The vocal patterns suggest multiple infected individuals speaking in unison, their speech coordinated by the collective consciousness. "They've learned to use our own communication technology against us." She paused, her scientific mind racing through implications that defied everything they thought they knew about the pathogen. If they can coordinate complex vocalizations and operate electronic equipment, then their intelligence level is approaching or exceeding average human cognitive function. The transmission continued with chilling eloquence. You have fought bravely, but your resistance is futile. Join us, and your consciousness will become part of something greater than individual existence. Refuse, and you will be consumed in ways that will preserve your awareness even as your body serves our purposes. Choose quickly, our patience is not infinite. Alistair Ravencroft stood slowly, his face gray with the realization that their situation had fundamentally changed. This isn't just about survival anymore. If the infected have developed this level of intelligence and communication ability, then Project Renaissance may be our only chance to prevent them from eventually developing technology that could threaten any remaining human populations worldwide. Lyra Nightingale's instruments detected increasing electromagnetic activity surrounding Haven City, as if millions of infected brains were generating a collective bioelectric field strong enough to interfere with their equipment. The infected aren't just moving toward us, they're creating some kind of neural network that's affecting our electronics. Our defensive systems are experiencing random failures, and communication with the outside world is becoming increasingly difficult. Dr. Webb's voice cut through the static with desperate urgency. Haven City, you need to make a decision now. Our satellite tracking shows the infected forces will reach your outer perimeter in less than 4 hours. If you're going to activate Project Renaissance, the preparation sequence needs to begin immediately. The orbital alignment window closes in 36 hours, after which the countermeasure cannot be deployed. Zephyr looked around the room at the faces of his advisors, seeing his own mixture of determination and terror reflected in their expressions. 70,000 people slept fitfully in the levels above them, trusting in their leaders to find a way through humanity's darkest hour. Children dreamed of playgrounds and birthday parties while their parents stood guard against nightmares that had once existed only in fiction. Dr. Webb, Zephyr said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to authorize, begin the preparation sequence for Project Renaissance. But first, I want to address our people. They deserve to know what we're asking of them. The weight of 70,000 lives pressed down on the command center as morning light began to filter through the reinforced windows. Outside the walls, the infected masses had grown quiet, their collective intelligence perhaps sensing that humanity's final gambit was about to begin. In the growing silence, the sound of children playing seemed both heartbreaking and sacred, a reminder of everything they were fighting to preserve. The emergency broadcast system activated at exactly 0600 hours, its tone piercing through every speaker in Haven City. In apartments carved from converted office buildings, families gathered around radios with the same reverence their ancestors had shown during wartime addresses. Children who had never known a world without constant danger pressed close to their parents, sensing the gravity of the moment even if they couldn't fully comprehend its implications. Commander Zephyr Blackwood's voice carried through the fortress with the steady authority that had kept hope alive through humanity's darkest months. Citizens of Haven City, this is your commander speaking. I'm addressing you today because you deserve to know the truth about our situation and the choice that lies before us all. He paused, gathering strength for words that would define the final chapter of human civilization. In the command center, Dr. Cassiopeia Thorne monitored the infected forces through long-range sensors, watching as 2 million creatures arranged themselves in formations that defied every assumption about undead behavior. The infected had stopped their constant moaning, creating an eerie silence that was somehow more terrifying than their previous cacophony. They stood in perfect ranks like a vast army awaiting orders, their dead eyes fixed on Haven City's walls with patient malevolence. The pathogen that destroyed our world has evolved beyond our worst nightmares, Zephyr continued, his words carried to every corner of the fortress. The infected are no longer mindless creatures, they have developed a collective intelligence that makes them more dangerous than any enemy humanity has ever faced. Our scientists have worked tirelessly to find a solution, and one exists, but it requires a sacrifice that will test the very core of who we are as a species. Serafina Cross watched the faces of civilians gathered in the main courtyard, seeing fear and confusion mixed with the stubborn determination that had carried them through months of impossible hardship. A young mother held her infant son close to her chest, while elderly survivors who remembered the world before the outbreak stood with the dignity of those who had already witnessed the end of everything they had ever known. Dr. Ophelia Sterling moved through the medical bay, ensuring that pain medication was distributed to those who might need it in the coming hours. Her gentle hands offered comfort to patients who understood that traditional medicine could no longer address their fundamental predicament. The wounded defenders from the outer perimeter spoke in hushed tones about the infected forces beyond the walls, describing coordination and intelligence that challenged everything they thought they knew about their enemies. Dr. Webb in Atlanta has developed a countermeasure called Project Renaissance, Zephyr's voice continued. It can disrupt the collective consciousness that drives the infected, potentially breaking their coordination and returning them to their original, mindless state. However, deploying this countermeasure requires using one of our remaining population centers as a transmission hub. The electromagnetic pulse generated by the process will make survival impossible for anyone in the target area. The silence that followed his words was profound, broken only by the soft sobbing of those who finally understood the true nature of their choice. Dante Wolfsburg stood on the eastern wall, watching the infected army through high-powered binoculars. The creatures had arranged themselves in complex geometric patterns that seemed to pulse with mathematical precision, suggesting an intelligence that might rival human strategic thinking. Maximus Kane coordinated the final defensive preparations with grim efficiency. Ammunition was distributed according to carefully calculated ratios, with enough rounds reserved for a final option that no one wanted to discuss openly. Civilian volunteers took positions alongside professional soldiers, their faces bearing the same expression of determined resignation that had carried humanity through its greatest challenges. "I won't lie to you about the nature of this choice," Zephyr continued. "If we refuse to activate Project Renaissance, our defenses will fall within hours. The infected will overwhelm us, and humanity's last stronghold will become another addition to their expanding network. If we agree to serve as the transmission hub, we will die, but our sacrifice might give the remaining human survivors across the world a chance to reclaim their planet." Lyra Nightingale detected massive electromagnetic fluctuations emanating from the infected army, as if millions of brains were generating a collective signal that was growing stronger by the hour. Her instruments showed patterns that resembled complex communication networks, suggesting that the infected were not only coordinating their current assault but planning for a post-human future. In apartments throughout the fortress, families held each other close and spoke of memories from the world before the outbreak. Parents told children stories about birthday parties and summer vacations, while elderly survivors shared tales of their youth with anyone who would listen. The collected memories of human civilization were being preserved in the hearts and minds of those who would carry them into whatever came next. "The decision must be made collectively," Zephyr announced. "Every adult citizen of Haven City will have the opportunity to vote on whether we activate Project Renaissance. The choice is not mine alone to make, it belongs to all of us together. Voting will take place in 1 hour, and the results will be binding regardless of the outcome." Dr. Webb's voice crackled through the communication array with increasing desperation. "Haven City, our satellite tracking shows the infected forces are beginning their final approach. You have perhaps 3 hours before they reach your outer perimeter. The preparation sequence for Project Renaissance takes 2 hours to complete, which means the decision point is approaching rapidly." As the voting hour approached, 70,000 people faced the most profound choice in human history. Children too young to vote clung to their parents, while teenagers who had been forced to become adults before their time stood ready to accept whatever decision their community made. The weight of human civilization rested on the shoulders of survivors who had already sacrificed everything except their lives for the chance to see another dawn. Outside the walls, 2 million infected creatures stood in perfect silence, their collective intelligence perhaps understanding that humanity's final gambit was about to unfold. In the growing tension between the fortress and the army beyond, the future of conscious life on Earth hung in the balance. ##Part 7, The Last Vote of Humanity. The voting commenced at precisely 0700 hours in a scene that would have been unimaginable in the world before the outbreak. Citizens lined up in orderly queues throughout Haven City's converted facilities, their faces bearing the weight of a decision that transcended personal survival. The ballot was simple, a single question that would determine whether humanity chose martyrdom in the hope of resurrection or defiance in the face of certain extinction. Dr. Cassiopeia Thorne cast her vote with hands that had spent countless hours searching for a cure that ultimately proved elusive. As a scientist, she understood the mathematical certainty of their situation better than most. Without Project Renaissance, human extinction was guaranteed within 6 months. With it, they had a statistical probability of survival that her rational mind could not ignore, even as her heart broke for what they were about to sacrifice. Commander Zephyr Blackwood voted last, as was his privilege as leader, but his choice had been made hours ago when he accepted the burden of command in humanity's final hour. He had signed death warrants before, sent soldiers into battles they might not survive, but never had he faced a decision that required him to sign the death certificate of his entire civilization in the hope of its eventual rebirth. The infected army had begun moving closer to the outer perimeter, their formations shifting with fluid precision that spoke of a unified intelligence orchestrating every movement. Scouts reported that some of the creatures had begun vocalizing in what sounded like organized chanting, their voices creating harmonics that seemed designed to unsettle human defenders. The psychological warfare was as sophisticated as their tactical coordination. Dante Wolfsburg watched the vote count through the reinforced windows of the command center, his warrior's instincts warring with emotions he hadn't felt since losing his unit in Chicago. Every person walking past represented a life that had fought its way through hell to reach this moment, and now they were calmly voting for their own destruction in the hope that others might survive. Dr. Ophelia Sterling had prepared syringes of morphine for those who might need them in the final hours, her medical oath to do no harm transformed into a promise to ensure that suffering would be minimized when the end came. She had voted yes with tears streaming down her face, understanding that her decision would save countless future patients she would never meet. Serafina cross-coordinated the vote count with the same meticulous attention to detail she had brought to communications throughout the crisis. Even in humanity's final democratic process, accuracy mattered. Future historians, if any survived to write the story, would need to understand that this choice was made freely by informed citizens who understood the full implications of their decision. Maximus Kane voted while simultaneously coordinating defensive preparations for what everyone hoped would be an unnecessary final stand. His prosthetic arm gleamed as he adjusted weapon placements and ammunition distribution, ensuring that if Project Renaissance failed, Haven City would at least face its end with weapons in hand rather than surrender to creatures that had already demonstrated their capacity for sophisticated cruelty. Alistair Ravencroft stood before the ballot box with the bearing of a statesman who had spent his career making decisions for others, now faced with a choice that would affect every human being on Earth. His vote represented not just his personal judgment but his faith in democratic principles even when democracy was voting for its own dissolution. Lyra Nightingale detected increasing communication activity among the infected forces, their bioelectric signatures creating patterns that resembled military command structures. The creatures were not just coordinating their assault, they were adapting their tactics in real time based on observations of Haven City's defensive preparations. Their intelligence was not only equal to human strategic thinking but might already exceed it in some areas. As the voting concluded, Dr. Webb's voice carried through the communication array with barely controlled urgency. Haven City, our monitoring stations detect that the infected forces have begun accelerating their approach. The outer elements of their army will reach your perimeter in approximately 90 minutes. If you're going to activate Project Renaissance, the final preparation phase must begin within 30 minutes. The vote count was completed with military efficiency, and Serafina announced the results to the assembled community with a voice that managed to remain steady despite the magnitude of what she was reporting. "The vote is conclusive," she declared. 62,417 citizens voted in favor of activating Project Renaissance. 7,583 voted against. The measure passes by an overwhelming majority. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by quiet sobbing and the distant sound of infected forces moving through the wasteland beyond. Parents held their children closer, lovers shared what they knew would be their final kisses, and strangers embraced with the understanding that humanity was facing its end together. Zephyr activated the communication link to Atlanta with hands that betrayed the first tremor he had shown throughout the crisis. Dr. Webb, this is Haven City Command. The vote has been completed and counted. We authorize activation of Project Renaissance. Begin the final preparation sequence immediately. The response came through static that seemed to pulse with otherworldly interference. Acknowledged, Haven City. Project Renaissance final sequence initiating now. Estimated time to deployment, 120 minutes. Commander, it has been an honor to work with you during humanity's darkest hour. Your sacrifice will not be forgotten. As the infected army drew closer to Haven City's walls, 70,000 people began preparing for humanity's final act of defiance. They had voted to die so that their species might live, choosing sacrifice over surrender in the hope that somewhere in the vast darkness of their broken world, enough humans remained to inherit whatever future Project Renaissance might create. The final hour arrived with the crimson light of dawn breaking over Haven City's walls, casting long shadows across the courtyard where 70,000 people had gathered to face the end together. The infected army stood motionless at the perimeter, their collective intelligence perhaps sensing that something momentous was about to unfold. The creature's silence was more terrifying than their previous moaning had ever been, suggesting an awareness that transcended mere hunger or aggression. Commander Zephyr Blackwood stood on the central platform that had once served as a memorial for the fallen, now repurposed as humanity's final podium. His weathered face reflected the weight of every decision that had brought them to this moment, and his voice carried across the fortress with the authority of someone who had led his people through the unthinkable. Citizens of Haven City, we stand together at the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. What we do in the next few minutes will echo through whatever future awaits our species. Dr. Cassiopeia Thorne monitored the final preparations from the underground research facility, her instruments tracking the orbital alignment that would make Project Renaissance possible. The satellite network that would carry their sacrifice to the infected hordes around the world was powering up, its systems drawing energy from every remaining power grid on the continent. Her calculations showed a 73% probability of success, numbers that seemed both reassuring and inadequate when weighed against the magnitude of their gamble. In the medical bay, Dr. Ophelia Sterling moved among those who had chosen sedation for the final moments, her gentle hands offering comfort to patients who faced death with the dignity of those who had already endured the unendurable. Children slept peacefully in their parents' arms while elderly survivors who remembered the world before shared quiet stories of lives well lived and love that would endure beyond the grave. Dante Wolfsburg stood at the eastern wall, his weapons trained on the infected masses even though he knew that conventional warfare had become meaningless. The creatures had arranged themselves in perfect circles that stretched to the horizon, their formations creating geometric patterns that suggested mathematical precision beyond human comprehension. Some small part of his warrior's spirit took comfort in facing the end with a rifle in his hands and defiance in his heart. Serafina Cross maintained communications with the scattered survivor groups across the continent, relaying final messages from families separated by thousands of miles and months of silence. Her voice carried words of love and hope to settlements that might never know whether Project Renaissance succeeded or failed, binding the remnants of humanity together with threads of connection that death itself could not sever. Maximus Kane coordinated the fortress's final defensive preparations with the precision of a lifetime soldier, ensuring that every weapon was loaded and every position was manned even though they all understood that their resistance would last only minutes once the infected began their assault. His prosthetic arm gleamed in the morning light as he saluted each defender, offering the respect that warriors deserved regardless of the outcome of their final battle. Lyra Nightingale detected massive electromagnetic fluctuations emanating from the infected army, their collective neural activity creating interference patterns that suggested they were preparing for something unprecedented. Her instruments showed communication signals that resembled the patterns generated by Project Renaissance itself, as if the infected intelligence was attempting to counter whatever humanity was planning. Dr. Webb's voice cut through the static for the final time, his transmission carrying the weight of a man who had dedicated his life to saving a species that might already be beyond salvation. Haven City, this is Atlanta Control. Project Renaissance is fully powered and ready for deployment. The orbital window opens in 60 seconds. Commander, it has been the highest honor of my career to serve alongside you. May whatever God still watch over humanity grant that our sacrifice bears fruit in a world we will never see. Zephyr looked out over the gathered citizens of Haven City, seeing faces that had become family through months of shared struggle and hope. A young girl waved at him from the crowd, her smile as bright as sunshine despite the darkness surrounding them. An elderly couple held hands with the contentment of those who had found love even in the depths of hell. Teenagers who had been forced to become adults stood ready to face eternity with courage that would have impressed the greatest heroes of human history. Whatever happens next, Zephyr announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the fortress, remember that we chose this path together. We chose sacrifice over surrender, hope over despair, and the future over the present. If our species survives, it will be because 70,000 people stood together on this day and chose to believe that love is stronger than death. The infected army began moving forward with synchronized precision, their collective intelligence finally triggering the assault that would either face empty walls or a futile final resistance. But as they approached Haven City's perimeter, the morning sky suddenly blazed with light that seemed to emerge from every star in the galaxy simultaneously. Project Renaissance activated with a flash that could be seen from orbit, its electromagnetic pulse racing outward at the speed of light to touch every infected creature on the continent. The collective scream that arose from 2 million throats was both triumphant and agonized, the sound of a vast intelligence experiencing death and transformation simultaneously. In the moments before the light consumed them, Zephyr saw the infected masses suddenly freeze as their network connection severed. Individual creatures began stumbling and falling as their shared consciousness fragmented, returning them to the mindless state that humanity had always hoped to achieve. Project Renaissance was working, but the price had been paid in full. Haven City vanished in a burst of energy that reshaped the electromagnetic spectrum itself, taking with it the last concentrated population of human beings in North America. But across the continent and around the world, scattered survivors emerged from hiding places to find that the infected hordes had suddenly become manageable again, their collective intelligence broken and their coordination shattered. Years later, when historians tried to piece together the final days of the Great Outbreak, they would speak of Haven City as humanity's greatest sacrifice and its finest hour. Children who grew up in the rebuilt world would learn about Commander Zephyr Blackwood and Dr. Cassiopeia Thorne, about Dante Wolfsburg's courage and Dr. Ophelia Sterling's compassion. They would study the final transmission from Haven City, preserved by Lyra Nightingale's equipment and carried to safety by the electromagnetic pulse itself. But on quiet evenings when the wind blew just right across the plains where Haven City once stood, some survivors claimed they could still hear the sound of children playing, the echo of voices raised in final defiance, and the whispered promise that love would endure long after the last zombie had fallen to dust. In the end, humanity's renaissance had begun not with conquest but with sacrifice, not with hatred but with hope, and not with an ending but with the eternal possibility of new beginnings born from the ashes of those who chose to light the way forward into an uncertain but survivable future.